Jackson Donovan's life had been meticulously crafted, a sturdy marriage of 11 years, 2 children who were the center of his universe, and a career as an architect that brought him both pride and purpose. His wife, Melanie, was the embodiment of charm, her laugh a melody that once made his heart soar. Together, they had built a life that others admired, a picture of suburban bliss. But like all polished veneers, cracks had started to appear, subtle and insidious. It began with small things. Melanie's increasing preoccupation with her phone, the muffled conversations she dismissed as work calls, and the growing distance in their once effortless companionship. Jackson tried to brush it off as the natural ebb and flow of marriage, attributing her mood swings and distracted demeanor to stress. After all, Melanie was the kind of woman who thrived on her image, and her job as a real estate agent kept her constantly on edge. One Thursday evening, Jackson came home to find the house unusually quiet. The children were at their grandparents', giving them a rare moment of solitude. Melanie sat in the living room, the faint glow of her phone illuminating her face. Her expression shifted quickly when she noticed him, a flicker of guilt before morphing into a rehearsed smile. "Hey, babe," she said casually, tucking her phone into her pocket. "Dinner's in the oven." Jackson nodded, distracted by the dissonance he couldn't quite place. Later that night, as Melanie showered, he noticed her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. It was unlocked, the screen displaying a flurry of notifications from a contact labeled Amanda. Curiosity wrestled with conscience, but the notifications were persistent, and something about the tone of the messages gnawed at him. He picked up the phone, scrolling through the texts. His heart sank as he read the exchanges. There were no words from an Amanda, only suggestive messages and photos from a man named Ryan, someone Jackson didn't know but whose familiarity with his wife was undeniable. The weight of the discovery was suffocating. Jackson sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone, his chest tightening with a mix of fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. Melanie's voice startled him from the bathroom. "Hey, can you grab me a towel?" she called out, oblivious to the tempest brewing just beyond the door. Jackson handed her the towel without meeting her eyes. For the rest of the night, he feigned normalcy, his mind churning with questions. Who was Ryan? How long had this been going on? And most hauntingly, why? The following days were a blur of observation and internal conflict. Jackson began piecing together the puzzle. The sudden late-night showings Melanie claimed were for clients, the expensive lingerie he hadn't seen her wear, the mysterious charges on their credit card. The evidence was damning, but he needed more than suspicions. One evening, as Melanie headed out for another showing, Jackson decided to follow her. He kept a safe distance as she drove across town to a quaint boutique hotel. From the shadows of his car, he watched her meet Ryan in the parking lot. Their embrace was intimate, their laughter echoing through the chilly night air. Jackson's hands clenched the steering wheel as he watched them disappear into the building. The betrayal was now undeniable, a knife twisting in his chest. But amid the pain, a spark of resolve ignited within him. Jackson was not the kind of man to crumble under adversity. If Melanie thought she could shatter their life without consequence, she was gravely mistaken. He spent the next few weeks in a state of calculated restraint, gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, and carefully masking his emotions. But as he meticulously planned his response, a thought began to take root. Why stop at simply exposing the affair? If Melanie and her lover thought they were invincible, Jackson intended to prove them wrong in the most poetic way possible. The opportunity came unexpectedly. During a routine meeting at the architecture firm where Jackson worked, he was introduced to Lauren, a striking woman with a sharp wit and a piercing gaze. She was there as a consultant, her presence commanding attention. Over the course of the project, they struck up a rapport, exchanging ideas and sharing stories about their personal lives. One evening, as they worked late, Jackson noticed Lauren's somber expression. She confessed that her husband, Ryan, had been acting distant lately. The name jolted Jackson. Could it be the same Ryan? Subtly, he steered the conversation, learning details that confirmed his suspicion. Lauren's husband was indeed the man who had turned his life upside down. The revelation felt like fate intervening, offering Jackson a weapon he hadn't anticipated, a way to hit back at both Melanie and Ryan with surgical precision. Jackson didn't rush into action. Instead, he deepened his connection with Lauren, his intentions hidden beneath layers of empathy and charm. She was vulnerable, and while a part of him felt a twinge of guilt, his desire for retribution overpowered his hesitation. He found solace in her company, and soon, their shared pain became the bridge to an intimacy either had planned. The night Jackson made his move was one he would never forget. Lauren had invited him over for dinner, the atmosphere charged with unspoken tension. As they shared a bottle of wine, laughter turned to lingering glances, and one thing led to another. In that moment, Jackson felt a cathartic release, not just of his anger but of the helplessness that had consumed him since discovering Melanie's betrayal. As he lay beside Lauren, a sense of vindication washed over him. The path he had chosen was unorthodox, even morally questionable, but it was his way of reclaiming power in a situation designed to render him powerless. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, Jackson felt like he was in control. The wheels of his revenge were now in motion, and there was no turning back. Jackson awoke the next morning to the soft light filtering through Lauren's bedroom curtains. For a fleeting moment, the weight that had been pressing on his chest for weeks felt lighter. Lauren lay beside him, her breathing soft and steady, a faint smile playing on her lips even in sleep. But as Jackson stared at the ceiling, the reality of what he had done settled like a stone in his stomach. He slipped out of bed carefully, gathering his clothes and dressing in silence. Lauren stirred slightly but didn't wake. Jackson leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment longer. She looked peaceful, far more peaceful than he felt. By the time he stepped out into the crisp morning air, his mind was already racing. The previous night had been a calculated move, one designed to level the scales of betrayal. But the satisfaction he thought he'd feel was muted, dulled by something he couldn't quite name. Revenge was messy. And now, it was personal. That evening, Melanie returned home earlier than usual. Jackson was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey as he prepared dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and for once, the house felt warm, familiar even. "Something smells amazing," Melanie said, dropping her purse by the door. Jackson watched her carefully, noting the way she avoided his gaze as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Figured we could have dinner together for once," he replied. "It's been a while since we had a proper night in." Melanie smiled, but Jackson caught the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. "Yeah, it has," she agreed, swirling the wine in her glass. They ate in near silence, save for the occasional scrape of cutlery. Jackson played the role of the oblivious husband well, asking about her day, nodding at her vague responses. But the closer he watched, the more cracks he saw. She was nervous, distracted. Her phone never left her side. "Ryan must be keeping you busy," Jackson said casually, stabbing at his food. Melanie froze for half a second. A blink and you miss it reaction, but Jackson caught it. "I told you, he's one of our biggest clients," she replied too quickly. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Jackson smiled. "I didn't say anything was out of the ordinary." Melanie's fork hovered over her plate for a moment before she set it down and excused herself to the bathroom. As soon as she disappeared down the hall, Jackson's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Lauren, I can't stop thinking about last night. Call me when you can." Jackson stared at the message, conflicted. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard before finally typing back, "Soon." Upstairs, the water ran from the bathroom sink, but Melanie didn't return for several minutes. Jackson leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the situation wash over him. This game they were playing, both of them, had only just begun. Jackson's focus shifted in the following days. He didn't confront Melanie outright. He had no desire to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could manipulate her way out of it with half-baked apologies and excuses. Instead, he continued to build his case. His phone was filled with screenshots, text messages, and photos he'd taken discreetly. Every late-night rendezvous, Every charge to their joint account. It was all there. Evidence that painted the clearest picture of Melanie's betrayal. But there was something more pressing. Ryan. The man who had so casually slipped into Jackson's life, worming his way not just into Melanie's bed, but into the fabric of Jackson's marriage. That was the part that Jackson couldn't stomach. Late one afternoon, Jackson found himself parked outside Ryan and Lauren's house. It was a modest home, not unlike his own. Lauren's car was in the driveway, but Ryan's wasn't. Jackson debated knocking but ultimately decided against it. The real revenge wasn't about confrontation. It was about control. He drove to the office instead, where he knew Ryan's firm had headquarters nearby. Parking a few blocks away, Jackson waited. It wasn't long before Ryan emerged, laughing with colleagues as they headed to their cars. Jackson followed at a distance, trailing Ryan until he pulled into a sleek bar downtown. A few phone calls later, Jackson had quietly arranged a meeting with Lauren. Lauren arrived at the bar an hour later, slipping into the booth where Jackson waited. "What's this about?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Jackson set his phone on the table and slid it toward her. Lauren glanced at the screen, her expression hardening as she scrolled through the damning evidence. "Melanie," Jackson said, watching her carefully. "And Ryan." Lauren's hands trembled as she lowered the phone. She exhaled slowly, eyes locking with Jackson's. "I suspected as much," she whispered. "But seeing it..." Jackson nodded. "I thought you deserved to know." Lauren's expression shifted, her gaze darkening with a quiet rage Jackson hadn't seen in her before. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, her voice calm but cold. Jackson met her stare head-on. "I want him to feel it," he said simply. "Every inch of betrayal. But I can't do it alone." Lauren didn't hesitate. "I'm in." The alliance was forged. Over the next week, Jackson and Lauren began working together, plotting in secret. They exchanged notes, coordinated accidental run-ins, and slowly chipped away at the lives Melanie and Ryan had so carelessly built. It wasn't long before the cracks started to show. Ryan began to grow suspicious, his conversations with Melanie becoming terse and filled with tension. Melanie, too, grew distant, sensing the shift but unable to pinpoint its source. Jackson watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. The unraveling had begun, and he would ensure either of them escaped unscathed. Jackson's patience was wearing thin. Weeks had passed since he and Lauren had joined forces, and while the cracks in Melanie and Ryan's affair were widening, Jackson wanted more. Their lives were unraveling, but not fast enough for his taste. He wanted it to collapse in flames. On a crisp Friday evening, Jackson stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Tonight was pivotal. Lauren had invited him to dinner, just the two of them. It wasn't unusual, but tonight felt different. There was a lingering tension between them that neither had addressed. As Jackson slipped on his blazer, Melanie called from the other room. "Where are you off to?" she asked, her tone casual, but Jackson caught the edge in her voice. "Client dinner," he replied smoothly. "Might run late." Melanie frowned, leaning against the doorframe. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she could sense something was off, but she didn't press the issue. "Don't drink too much," she said lightly. Jackson smiled. "Don't wait up." He grabbed his keys and left without looking back. Lauren had chosen a sleek, intimate restaurant on the outskirts of town. Dim lighting, soft music, and hushed voices created an atmosphere that felt private, almost too private. Jackson found her at the bar, sipping red wine and swirling the glass absent-mindedly. She looked up when he approached, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "Right on time," she murmured, setting the glass down. "Wouldn't miss it," Jackson replied, taking the seat beside her. Their conversation danced around the inevitable. They spoke of work, children, even vacations that never happened. But there was an unspoken acknowledgement hanging in the air. Both of them knew why they were here, and neither dared to address it head-on. After their meal, Lauren invited him back to her place under the pretense of showing him something for their ongoing project. Jackson accepted without hesitation. Lauren's home was warm, tastefully decorated, and utterly devoid of Ryan's presence. It was as if she had already begun to erase him from her life, piece by piece. They settled on the couch, the space between them charged with an energy that Jackson could feel humming beneath his skin. "Do you ever think about how this ends?" Lauren asked suddenly, her gaze fixed on him. Jackson considered the question carefully. He had thought about it. Many times. "I don't think it does," he admitted. "I think we let it keep unraveling until there's nothing left of them." Lauren leaned closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Jackson could feel the warmth of her breath, the way her body fit perfectly against his side. "I'm not sure if this is about revenge anymore," she whispered. Jackson shifted slightly, tilting his head to meet her eyes. "Then what is it about?" Lauren didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her lips to his, and the line between right and wrong blurred until it vanished completely. The affair ignited quickly, burning hotter and faster than Jackson had anticipated. What began as a calculated move evolved into something tangled and complicated. He told himself it was part of the plan, that seducing Ryan's wife was nothing more than strategic retaliation. But as nights spent with Lauren grew longer and more intimate, Jackson couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. It wasn't just revenge anymore. One evening, as Jackson lay in Lauren's bed, his phone buzzed with a text from Melanie. "Melanie, where are you?" He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. "Late meeting." He tossed the phone aside, guilt brushing the edges of his consciousness but never fully settling. Melanie had crossed this line long before he had. On Saturday afternoon, Jackson returned home to find Melanie in the kitchen, dressed more elegantly than usual. The kids were at a friend's house, leaving the two of them alone. "Going somewhere?" Jackson asked, leaning against the doorway. Melanie turned, startled by his sudden presence. "Brunch with Amanda," she said casually. Jackson raised a brow, crossing his arms. "Amanda, huh?" Melanie's lips twitched into a nervous smile. "Yes, Amanda." He didn't press her. He simply nodded, stepping aside as she brushed past him. But as Melanie left the house, Jackson knew exactly where she was going. Lauren had followed Ryan to a hotel just the week before, capturing photos that left little to the imagination. Jackson had them saved on his phone, evidence that he occasionally glanced at when he needed to remind himself why he was doing this. As Melanie's car disappeared down the street, Jackson's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Lauren. "Lauren, tonight. My place." Jackson exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Part of him wondered if this dance they were doing was sustainable. Another part, the darker part, wanted to see how far they could push the limits before everything shattered. That evening, as Jackson left for Lauren's, Melanie was nowhere to be found. He had grown used to her disappearing acts, and by now, they no longer bothered him. Lauren greeted him at the door with a glass of wine, leading him inside without a word. They didn't speak much that night. Words felt unnecessary. Afterward, as Jackson lay beside her, Lauren rolled over, tracing lazy circles on his chest. "I think Ryan knows something's wrong," she said softly. "He's been on edge lately." Jackson smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good." Lauren's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's dangerous, though. He's unpredictable when he's cornered." Jackson met her gaze, his tone unwavering. "So am I." The storm that had been brewing for months was about to break, and Jackson was ready to weather it. Jackson woke to the faint hum of Lauren's alarm. Soft light streamed through the curtains, casting gentle shadows across the room. She stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. Peaceful. But peace had no place in the war they were waging. Lauren shifted, stretching beneath the covers. "You're still here," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Jackson smirked. "Don't sound so shocked." "I'm not." She sat up, brushing her hair back. "I just figured you'd disappear before sunrise like usual." Jackson sat up beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "I didn't feel like running this time." Lauren studied him carefully. There was something unspoken in her eyes, something Jackson couldn't quite decipher. But whatever it was, she chose to bury it beneath a layer of practiced indifference. "Coffee?" she asked, climbing out of bed and slipping on his shirt. "Sure." As Lauren disappeared down the hall, Jackson reached for his phone. He hadn't checked it since the night before, and when the screen lit up, the flood of missed calls from Melanie was impossible to ignore. Melanie, 6 missed calls, Melanie, 2 new messages. His stomach knotted as he opened the messages. "Melanie, where the hell are you? Melanie, call me. Now." Jackson frowned. Melanie's usual evasiveness had been replaced by panic. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of the normal routine. His finger hovered over the call button, but he hesitated. The weight of the affair with Lauren was beginning to twist into something he hadn't anticipated, something dangerous. Still, curiosity won out. He hit call. Melanie answered on the first ring. "Jackson, where are you?" Her voice was sharp, laced with agitation. "Out," he replied simply. "What's wrong?" There was a pause, and he could almost hear the wheels in her head turning as she debated how much to say. "It's Ryan," she said finally. "He knows." Jackson's grip on the phone tightened. "Knows what?" "About you and Lauren." The words hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. Jackson's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where Lauren stood pouring coffee, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the walls of her home. "How?" Jackson's voice was low, deadly calm. "He followed me last night." Melanie's tone grew defensive. "He must have suspected something because he confronted me after I left the hotel." Jackson exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. This wasn't the plan. They were supposed to control the narrative, to keep Ryan spiraling until his world collapsed under the weight of his own lies. But now, the balance had shifted. "And what did you tell him?" Jackson asked coldly. "The truth." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Jesus, Melanie. I didn't have a choice," she snapped. "He's been losing it for weeks. I thought this would shut him down, but I think it made things worse." Jackson's mind raced. Ryan wasn't the type to take betrayal lightly. Jackson had always known that pushing him too far would lead to repercussions, but now, it seemed inevitable. "Is he coming after me?" Jackson asked. Melanie hesitated. "I don't know. But I'd watch your back if I were you." The line went dead. Jackson lowered the phone, staring blankly at the screen. He had assumed he could outmaneuver Ryan, that by the time Ryan figured out what was happening, it would be too late. But it seemed Ryan had been playing his own game in the shadows. Lauren reappeared, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She sank onto the bed beside him, pressing one into his hand. "Who was that?" she asked, noticing the tension in his face. Jackson took a long sip before answering. "Melanie. Ryan knows about us." Lauren's body stiffened. "What? How?" "He followed her. Confronted her last night." Lauren paled, setting her mug down on the nightstand with trembling fingers. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Jackson glanced at her, then out the window, where the early morning sun painted long shadows across the street. "We stay ahead of him," Jackson said firmly. "And we hit him harder." The next few days were a blur of paranoia and preparation. Jackson and Lauren exchanged information, tracked Ryan's movements, and ensured they never crossed paths with him directly. But the tension was suffocating, like waiting for an explosion that could go off at any moment. Jackson began noticing strange occurrences. His car, which had always been parked at his office lot without incident, suddenly had deep scratches along the side. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Ryan was taunting him, and Jackson could feel the walls closing in. One evening, as Jackson stepped into his driveway, he noticed a black sedan parked down the street. The engine was off, but the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat was unmistakable. Jackson locked eyes with him through the windshield. Even from a distance, he recognized Ryan's glare. The message was clear: "I see you." Jackson stood his ground, refusing to flinch. After a long, tense minute, Ryan's car roared to life and pulled away. Later that night, Jackson met Lauren at a quiet bar downtown. They sat in a booth at the back, both of them acutely aware of the invisible noose tightening around their necks. "I don't like this," Lauren admitted, stirring her drink absently. "Ryan's not just angry, he's dangerous." Jackson leaned forward, his eyes hard. "That's why we end it. For good." Lauren hesitated. "What does that mean?" Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "It means we stop letting him play the game. We control how this ends." Lauren swallowed hard, but she didn't argue. For the first time since this had all begun, Jackson felt certain. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was survival. Jackson's heart pounded as he drove home, his grip tightening around the steering wheel. The encounter with Ryan earlier that evening still lingered, the man's stare burned into his memory. Jackson could feel the shift. Ryan wasn't just watching. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. Melanie's warning replayed in his mind like a haunting echo. "I'd watch your back if I were you." Jackson pulled into the driveway, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the black sedan. Nothing. But that didn't mean Ryan wasn't lurking nearby. As Jackson stepped inside, Melanie was waiting at the kitchen table, arms crossed over her chest. Her phone lay face down in front of her, and from the expression on her face, Jackson could tell she had been stewing for hours. "We need to talk," she said flatly. Jackson set his keys down and leaned against the counter. "About what?" Melanie's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb. Ryan's unraveling, and you're pouring gasoline on the fire." Jackson crossed his arms, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm not the one who started this, Melanie." "You did." Melanie scoffed, pushing up from the table. "Oh, please. You could have walked away." "But no, you had to crawl into bed with his wife." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Funny. You weren't so concerned about consequences when you were sneaking around with him behind my back." The room fell into tense silence. Melanie glared at him for a long moment before finally sighing and running a hand through her hair. "This isn't about us anymore," she muttered. "It's about what happens next." Jackson softened, sensing the fear that lingered beneath her anger. Melanie may have betrayed him, but even she wasn't prepared for the storm Ryan was about to unleash. "I'll handle Ryan," Jackson said firmly. "You don't need to worry." Melanie shook her head. "You don't get it. Ryan's not the type to let this slide. He's not just angry, he's dangerous, Jackson." Jackson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know. That's why we end it before he does." Melanie frowned, her arms dropping to her sides. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Jackson didn't answer. The following morning, Jackson met Lauren at her house. She opened the door without a word, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Jackson could see the worry etched into her face, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like an anchor. Ryan hadn't been home the night before, and she hadn't slept. Jackson stepped inside, brushing his hand against hers briefly. The small touch grounded them both. "Any sign of him?" Jackson asked as Lauren led him to the kitchen. Lauren shook her head. "No. But I know he's watching. I can feel it." Jackson pulled out a chair, sitting down across from her. "It's only a matter of time before he makes a move." Lauren's eyes darkened. "I know. But I'm not going to sit around waiting for it." Jackson leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Neither am I." Lauren hesitated, her gaze dropping to the cup of tea in front of her. "I'm scared, Jackson. Ryan's unpredictable." Jackson reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "We'll get through this. Together." The words felt hollow, but Jackson needed to believe them. By the time Jackson returned home that afternoon, the black sedan was back. This time, it was parked directly across the street. Jackson's pulse quickened as he stepped out of his car, locking eyes with Ryan through the windshield. Ryan didn't flinch. He simply sat there, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jackson could feel the challenge radiating from the man. This wasn't just surveillance anymore, It was a declaration of war. He clenched his fists and approached the sedan, stopping just short of Ryan's window. For a moment neither man spoke. "You really think you're going to get away with this?" Ryan's voice was low, dangerous. Jackson met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not trying to get away with anything." Ryan's smirk widened. "That's cute. But I'm not the forgiving type, Jackson." Jackson exhaled slowly, his knuckles whitening at his sides. "Neither am I." Ryan laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire. And I promise you, you're not ready for the burn." Jackson took a step closer, his expression hardening. "If you wanted to do something, Ryan, you would have done it by now. So stop with the games." Ryan's eyes flashed, but he said nothing. Jackson leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've already won." Ryan's smile vanished. His hand tightened around the steering wheel, and for a moment, Jackson thought the man might snap. But instead, Ryan started the car, his gaze never leaving Jackson's. "This isn't over," Ryan said coldly before peeling away from the curb. Jackson stood there, watching the taillights disappear down the street. He didn't know if Ryan was bluffing or if the man truly had something planned. But either way, Jackson wasn't about to sit back and wait for him to strike. That evening, Jackson returned to Lauren's house. He could tell by the way she opened the door that she already knew something had happened. "He confronted me today," Jackson said as he stepped inside. Lauren's face paled. "What did he say?" Jackson shrugged. "He's trying to intimidate me. But I think he's bluffing." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope you're right." Jackson glanced around the room, his gaze settling on the bottle of wine sitting on the counter. He grabbed it and poured 2 glasses, handing one to Lauren. "To the storm," he said dryly, raising his glass. Lauren smirked, clinking her glass against his. "And to surviving it." Jackson watched her carefully as she sipped, his mind racing with thoughts of what Ryan's next move might be. But deep down, Jackson knew this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Jackson could feel it. The weight of everything he'd set in motion was beginning to crush down on him. The affair with Lauren, the confrontations with Ryan, the unspoken tension that now coated every interaction with Melanie. It was all converging, pressing in from every angle. He had thought he could control this. That by keeping Ryan and Melanie at arm's length, he could stay ahead. But the longer it dragged on, the more fragile the whole operation became. Lauren wasn't answering his calls. Jackson sat in his car outside her house, staring at the darkened windows. Her car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of movement inside. He had been calling for hours, each unanswered ring adding another layer of dread to his already fraying nerves. Ryan was quiet. Too quiet. Jackson glanced at his rearview mirror, half expecting the black sedan to appear at any moment. The absence of it felt louder than Ryan's threats. Pulling out his phone, Jackson dialed again. Lauren's name flashed on the screen, but this time, it went straight to voicemail. "Lauren, it's me. Call me back." The message felt inadequate, but Jackson didn't know what else to say. By morning, Jackson's unease had morphed into full-blown panic. Lauren still hadn't responded. He stopped by her office, but the receptionist informed him she hadn't shown up for work. His calls continued to go unanswered. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Jackson drove back to her house. This time, he knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked harder, his pulse quickening. "Lauren?" he called. The silence that followed stretched on longer than it should have. Jackson's hand hovered over the doorknob. It turned. The door creaked open, unlocked. Jackson stepped inside cautiously, calling Lauren's name again as he moved deeper into the house. The living room was in disarray, papers scattered across the coffee table, half-empty wine glasses sitting by the fireplace. Something felt wrong. Jackson's eyes landed on Lauren's phone, face down on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, his stomach lurching. 5 missed calls from Ryan. A cold sweat broke out across Jackson's back as he scanned the screen. Lauren's last message had been sent to him the previous night. "I think he's following me." Call me when you can. Jackson's hand shook slightly as he lowered the phone. Where was she? He turned and left the house, his thoughts spiraling. If Ryan had done something. Jackson forced the thought down. He needed to find Lauren, but he couldn't afford to lose his composure now. As Jackson climbed into his car, his phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Melanie. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But something told him not to. What is it? He answered, his voice sharp. You need to come home, Melanie said, her voice tight. What? Jackson, I'm serious. Get home. Now. There was a strange urgency in her tone that made Jackson's heart pound faster. Why? What's going on? It's Ryan, Melanie said quietly. He's here. Jackson felt his stomach drop. I'll be right there. When Jackson pulled into his driveway, Ryan's black sedan was parked across the street. Melanie was standing on the porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ryan leaned against his car, watching Jackson with a predatory calm that made the hairs on the back of Jackson's neck stand up. As Jackson stepped out of his car, Ryan pushed off the sedan and started walking toward him. Evening, Jackson, Ryan said coolly. Jackson squared his shoulders, feeling Melanie's eyes burning into the side of his head. What the hell do you want? Jackson asked. Ryan's smirk widened. Just came to chat. Catch up, you know? Jackson glanced at Melanie, who shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. Where's Lauren? Jackson asked, cutting straight to the point. Ryan's expression flickered, the smirk fading slightly. Funny you should ask that. Jackson's blood ran cold. Ryan took a step closer, lowering his voice. You thought you could waltz into my life, take what's mine, and walk away clean? Is that what you thought? Jackson's fists clenched at his sides. Where is she? Ryan's eyes narrowed. She's fine. For now. But if you keep poking around, I can't promise that'll stay the case. Jackson stepped forward, nearly nose to nose with Ryan. If you touch her. I already have, Jackson. Ryan interrupted, his tone smug. Just like you touched what's mine. Jackson's vision blurred with rage. He wanted to swing, every muscle in his body screamed for it, but he knew that's exactly what Ryan wanted. Instead, Jackson stepped back, his eyes locking with Ryan's. This ends tonight, Jackson said quietly. Ryan's smirk returned. Looking forward to it. He turned and strolled back to his car, leaving Jackson standing rigid in the driveway. Melanie approached cautiously. Jackson, what the hell is going on? Jackson didn't answer. His mind was already racing with one thought, get to Lauren. Hours later, Jackson found himself parked outside an unfamiliar address that Lauren had once mentioned. It was a small cabin tucked away at the edge of town, a place she liked to escape to when things became overwhelming. He knocked, heart hammering against his ribs. The door cracked open slightly, and there she was. Lauren's face was pale, her eyes red and tired. Relief flooded Jackson's chest. You're okay, he breathed. Lauren nodded, stepping aside to let him in. I had to get away. I couldn't stay at home. Jackson cupped her face, searching her eyes. Ryan knows where you are. You can't keep running from him. I don't have a choice, she whispered. Jackson exhaled, brushing his thumb over her cheek. Yes, you do. And I'm going to end this. Lauren's gaze softened, but doubt lingered in her eyes. How? She asked. Jackson's expression darkened. I'll make sure Ryan never touches either of us again. Jackson couldn't sleep. Lauren was safe, for now, but the knowledge that Ryan was circling them like a vulture kept him restless. His body ached with the tension of waiting, but Jackson knew the confrontation was inevitable. Sitting in the darkened living room, Jackson's thoughts spiraled. Every creak of the house made his pulse quicken. His phone sat on the coffee table, taunting him with its silence. He had half a mind to call Ryan himself, but he knew that would only feed into the other man's twisted sense of power. A soft knock at the door shattered the quiet. Jackson's heart skipped. Rising slowly, he moved toward the entrance. He peered through the peephole, his muscles tightening at the sight of Ryan standing on the porch, leaning casually against the doorframe. Jackson hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jackson growled, keeping his voice low. Ryan's eyes gleamed with amusement, but there was something darker simmering beneath the surface. "Relax," Ryan said, stepping closer but not crossing the threshold. "Just wanted to have a little chat. Face to face." Jackson crossed his arms, blocking the doorway. "I have nothing to say to you." Ryan's smirk didn't waver. "Oh, I think you do. Because here's the thing, Jackson, this doesn't end the way you think it will." Jackson's fists clenched. "Lauren's not part of this anymore. Leave her out of it." Ryan's gaze flickered with something cold and calculating. "She became part of it the second she let you into her bed." Jackson's patience was thinning. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Walk away, Ryan. I'm warning you." Ryan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about Lauren or Melanie. It's about respect." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "You wouldn't know respect if it hit you in the face." Ryan's smirk faltered for a brief second, but it was enough for Jackson to see beneath the mask. Ryan wasn't as in control as he pretended to be. "I'm not going to warn you again," Jackson said, his tone like steel. "Leave. Now." Ryan's eyes hardened, and for a moment, Jackson thought the man might swing. But instead, Ryan took a step back, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. "This isn't over," Ryan said quietly. "You're going to wish you handled this differently." Jackson didn't respond. He simply stared him down until Ryan turned and disappeared into the night. Lauren was waiting for Jackson the next day when he arrived at her cabin. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him pull into the gravel driveway. "You said you'd handle it," she said the moment he stepped out of the car. "I am," Jackson replied calmly. Lauren shook her head, frustration flickering in her eyes. "Ryan was outside my house this morning. Just sitting there. Watching." Jackson's hands tightened into fists. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Lauren's voice wavered, and Jackson could hear the exhaustion in it. "No," Jackson admitted. "Not unless we make him." Lauren's expression softened. She stepped closer, reaching out to take his hand. "What are you planning to do?" Jackson hesitated, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I don't know yet. But I promise you, he won't touch you again." Lauren's eyes held his for a long moment. "I'm scared, Jackson," she whispered. He cupped her face, pressing his forehead against hers. "So am I." For the first time, Jackson allowed himself to acknowledge the fear clawing at his chest. But fear wouldn't stop him. That evening, Jackson returned home to find Melanie in the kitchen, sipping wine by the sink. She barely glanced at him as he set his keys down. "I saw Ryan's car earlier," she said, swirling the glass in her hand. Jackson exhaled heavily, running a hand over his face. "You can't keep poking the bear, Jackson," Melanie continued, her voice distant. "Eventually, he's going to bite." Jackson leaned against the counter across from her, crossing his arms. "What do you want me to do? Let him keep threatening us?" Melanie's gaze shifted toward the window, her expression unreadable. "I didn't think it would go this far." "Well, it has." Jackson's tone sharpened. "And now we deal with it." Melanie finally met his eyes. "What does that mean?" Jackson hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "It means I'm not letting him control this anymore. He doesn't get to decide how this ends." Melanie watched him for a long moment before sighing, setting her wine glass down with a soft clink. "Just don't get yourself killed," she muttered before disappearing upstairs. Jackson remained in the kitchen long after she was gone, staring at the glass she left behind. The breaking point came 3 days later. Jackson was at the office when Lauren's call came through. Her voice trembled on the other end of the line. "He's here," she whispered. "Ryan. He's outside the cabin." Jackson's blood ran cold. "Call the police, he said immediately. I already did, but… Her voice cut off abruptly. Lauren? Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs. Lauren! No answer. Jackson grabbed his keys and sprinted out of the office, dialing her number repeatedly as he sped toward the cabin. Each ring that went unanswered twisted the knot in his stomach tighter. By the time Jackson arrived, Ryan's car was gone. The front door hung open slightly, creaking with the wind. Jackson burst inside, calling Lauren's name. He found her on the living room floor, clutching her arm. Blood seeped through her sleeve, and her face was pale. He just left, she gasped, eyes wide with shock. Jackson dropped to his knees, cradling her face. I'm taking you to the hospital. Lauren shook her head. No. I'll be fine. Jackson's heart pounded with rage as he examined her injury. A shallow cut. Ryan had left a mark, but just enough to send a message. This was no longer a Cold War. It was personal. Jackson kissed Lauren's forehead softly, his mind already shifting gears. Ryan had crossed a line. And Jackson was about to cross one too. Jackson wasn't the same man he'd been weeks ago. The betrayal, the threats, and now Lauren's blood, Ryan had turned him into something colder, something darker. That night, as Lauren slept fitfully in the cabin's spare room, Jackson stood by the window, staring out at the empty road. Every shadow felt like Ryan lurking just beyond his reach. Jackson's mind was made up. This wasn't going to end with police reports or restraining orders. It would end when Ryan understood the weight of his actions, when he felt the fear Jackson had lived with every day since this twisted game began. By morning, Jackson kissed Lauren softly on the forehead and promised he'd be back by noon. She didn't ask where he was going. Ryan's office was perched on the top floor of a downtown high-rise, an expansive space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive leather furniture. Jackson bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her protests, as he strode down the hall toward Ryan's office. Ryan was alone, seated behind his massive desk, sifting through documents like nothing had happened the night before. His eyes flicked up casually when Jackson entered. Well, this is unexpected, Ryan said with a slow smirk. Jackson shut the door behind him, locking it with a quiet click. We need to talk, Jackson said coldly. Ryan leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers behind his head. I was wondering when you'd show up. Jackson stepped closer, placing both hands on the desk as he leaned in. This ends now. Ryan chuckled under his breath. You've been saying that for weeks, Jackson. Yet here we are. Jackson's jaw tightened. You put your hands on her. Ryan's smirk faded, and something darker flickered in his eyes. I gave her a warning, Ryan replied smoothly. A soft one, compared to what could have happened. Jackson's fists curled, but he forced himself to stay calm. You think this is a game, Jackson said quietly. But you don't know how far I'm willing to go. Ryan stood slowly, circling around the desk until he was only inches away. Oh, I know exactly how far, Ryan whispered. You forget I've been where you are now. I know what desperation looks like. Jackson's gaze didn't waver. You don't know me, Jackson said, voice cold as ice. And that's your mistake. Ryan's smirk twisted into something cruel. I know enough. I know you're weak. You think sleeping with my wife gives you power, but it just makes you sloppy. Jackson exhaled, his grip tightening on the edge of the desk. Maybe, Jackson admitted. But I'm not the one who's going to lose everything. Ryan's eyes narrowed. Jackson reached into his jacket, pulling out a flash drive and tossing it onto Ryan's desk. What's this? Ryan asked, picking it up with a frown. Proof, Jackson said. Of everything. The affairs, the financial embezzlement, your offshore accounts. I've been collecting for weeks. Ryan's smirk evaporated. Jackson leaned in closer. You're going to walk away, Ryan? From me. From Lauren. From Melanie. Or this goes public. Ryan stared at the flash drive, his lips pressing into a thin line. You're bluffing, Ryan said, but Jackson could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Try me, Jackson replied, stepping back toward the door. Ryan watched him carefully, his hands tightening around the flash drive as though it might burn him. This isn't over, Ryan muttered, but the threat sounded weaker this time. Jackson paused by the door. Yeah, it is. When Jackson returned to the cabin, Lauren was waiting by the window, her face pale and anxious. What happened? She asked softly. Jackson set his keys down, crossing the room to take her hands in his. It's done, he said simply. Lauren searched his face for signs of doubt, but Jackson's eyes were steady. I don't know what I would have done without you, Lauren whispered. Jackson brushed his thumb over her cheek. You won't have to find out. Lauren's lips trembled slightly, and for the first time in weeks, Jackson felt the tension in his chest ease. They had survived. A week passed without incident. Ryan disappeared from their lives, resigning from his position and selling his home quietly. Rumors circulated about his sudden departure, but Jackson didn't care to explain. Melanie packed her bags 2 days later. There were no tears, no dramatic confrontations. Just the quiet understanding that their marriage had ended long before either of them admitted it. You'll still see the kids, Melanie said softly as she stood by the door. Jackson nodded. I know. And with that, she was gone. Months later, Jackson sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Lauren sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. I didn't think we'd make it through this, she admitted softly. Jackson wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. Neither did I, he said. But here we are. Lauren smiled faintly. I think this is the start of something better, she whispered. Jackson pressed a kiss to her forehead. It is. As the stars began to fill the sky, Jackson felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The storm had passed. And while the scars of betrayal remained, they no longer defined him. Lauren's hand found his, fingers entwining beneath the soft glow of moonlight. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And this time, Jackson knew they would win.